March 21st, 2006, George Bean of Palmdale, California ordered 2 Whopper Juniors and 2 cheeseburgers at a local Burger King drive-thru. The cost was $4.33. Those were the days, right, when you could get that kind of a food or that amount of food for $4.33. Well, it turns out that George Bean didn't get it for that cost either, because the cashier mistakenly moved the decimal points a few places and entered a $4,330 charge on his debit card. He didn't look at the receipt when he received it. He just put it with a bag and drove away like all the rest of us do, right? That account or that charge went through to his checking account, and he was overdrawn and left penniless. And he didn't find out until a day later. He was in panic, for the mortgage on his house was due, and there were outstanding checks that would surely bounce. And so he immediately contacted the local Burger King restaurant. The restaurant manager tried to work with the bank to get the charge refunded, but the bank had put a 3-day freeze on his account. This was to prevent a further overdraw on money that wasn't actually there any longer, and also to give the bank time to confirm the transaction before transferring the funds. Well, the problem was rectified in 3 days, and it all ended well, but it was a nerve-wracking 3 days for George and his wife. In an interview with a local TV station, Mrs. Bean said, "For 3 days, it was the most expensive meal in history." Well, I disagree with that. For in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve ate fruit which turned out to be an even more costly meal. It cost them their home in paradise and their relationship with God and unending life. And additional costs have been passed on to every man and woman who has lived on earth since then. Our sermon series is entitled Lessons from the Beginning, and we are exploring the foundational truths that God teaches us about our lives here in this world, as recorded in the first 6 chapters of the book of Genesis. This morning we're going to look at how the entire world was thrust into sin and suffered several curses, which has ruined the world and left us with the mess that we are in today, all as a result of the decision made by a woman. Now, that's not a very politically correct sounding statement, is it? Let's read the story before you form any conclusions. Genesis 3, verses 1 through 6. The serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. For you will not surely die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. We were represented in the Garden of Eden. For like Adam and Eve, we also sin. Like them, all of us are guilty. Now, there is probably a temptation that many of us share when we read this story to ask the question, well, who was the more guilty party? Who was it that Satan tempted? Who was it that was the one who took the first bite? Who introduced sin into the world? But equally important questions to ask are questions like these. Where was Adam when all of this was taking place? What did the text tell us? Where was Adam? He was right beside her. He was right there with her. Which leads us then to an additional important question. How could he have allowed this to happen? How could he have been so unengaged that he let his wife be lured into such terrible temptation? I'll tell you how. While all of this was going on, Adam was just standing there checking Eve out. That is one fine woman. You know that must have been the way it happened, right? We know how men think. He was standing there checking Eve out, completely unaware that there was even a conversation taking place. His eyes were wide open. His mouth was hanging open. And Eve just shoved that apple right in there. And if there is one thing that will take a man's mind off of his woman, it's dinner. Suddenly his mouth was full of forbidden fruit. Food. You know that's the way it had to be. There's no other logical explanation. What a doofus Adam was. Now, we could all sit here and have a little fun with this, and we can even self-righteously blame Adam or blame Eve or blame both of them for what happened. But the truth is, we are all guilty. Had we been there, it would have been the same with us. Had we been there, it would have been only a matter of time before any of us had committed some sin. After all, it took just one more person entering the world before there was a murderer. And it took just a few generations after Cain's lifetime before there was a bigamist. And by the time that man's next generation had lived, the world was so corrupt that God had to destroy it. That's human nature. It is our nature to sin. We are all guilty. Adam had heard the very words of God spoken to him from God's own mouth, and yet he participated in disobeying them. And he had certainly repeated to Eve that command that God had given him, those same words, maybe several times, and yet at the first time of temptation, she disobeyed them. And we know the words of God recorded in this book, and we have disobeyed them repeatedly. Like Adam and Eve, we are guilty. Like them, we are weakened by temptation. Let's examine Satan's tactics as he approached Eve and see how he destroyed her hesitation to disobey God. And she was hesitant to disobey. But he worked some tactics that I think that we will recognize in her life and caused her to stray. First, he created doubt in her mind. We saw that in verse 1, didn't we? When it said, he asked, did God really say you can't eat fruit from the trees in the garden? Satan wanted to cloud her mind with doubt. And in a similar way, Satan clouds our minds with doubt as well. So that we, like she perhaps began to, will question God. Well, did God really say that, or did some man just write that in? Is that really what God would be like, or are we depicting a picture of too high and mighty a being? That questioning, that doubting is the first step in rejecting God's will. And then Satan directly contradicted God, as we saw in verse 4 when he said, you surely won't die. He wanted her to think that a good God would never do something like that. And don't we hear that line of reasoning today? People attempting to justify sin will paint a picture of God that is different from what the scriptures tell us. Well, my God is loving. He would never condemn someone to hell for, and then you fill in the blank. And then Satan spoke a half-truth. And we understand, don't we, that a half-truth is really a lie. We see that in verse 5 when Satan told her, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That must have appealed to Eve's vanity, but he didn't tell her that that would not be a good thing, Yes, she would know evil, but she would know it by experiencing it. And she would also experience the repercussions of evil in her life. But Satan didn't tell her that. Many people today fall victim to Satan's false promises of fulfillment without full disclosure of the consequences. You'll love it, he whispers in our ear. But he doesn't tell us until you have to deal with the guilt. It will solve your problems, he tells us. But he doesn't tell us in the process it will also create more problems. It will feel great, Satan says. But he doesn't tell us that it might hurt somebody else. And then Satan convinced Eve that God was withholding a blessing from her. We see that also in the rest of verse 5. When he said, God knows that when you eat that fruit, you will be enlightened. Isn't God often depicted as a killjoy who makes pointless moral rules which prohibit us from enjoying life? That too is Satan's scam. And finally, Satan tempted Eve with desire, as we saw in verse 6, when it says that the woman saw that the fruit was pleasant to the eyes and desirable. Think of all the sin desire leads to. Theft and murder and adultery and sexual assault and gluttony and drunkenness and chemical addiction, and the list could go on. The gratification of our desires may be the greatest temptation we struggle with. Eve had a difficult time remembering God's command as Satan used all of his resources of temptation upon her. Even Adam could not utter a word of protest as they shared the forbidden fruit. By the way, what kind of fruit was it that God considered so crucial that they not eat? We traditionally use the term an apple, but we don't know. The Bible doesn't say what kind of fruit it was. It could have been a fruit that no longer even exists, because it wasn't about what kind of fruit it was. It wasn't about the fruit at all. It was about obedience to God. It was about choosing our will over his. It's about who is going to be God in our lives, him or us. What sin is it that Satan has been tempting you with? Understand this. That is his way of leading you away from God and destroying your soul. We were represented in the Garden of Eden. It wasn't just Adam and Eve who was guilty. It is all of us who are guilty. We were represented in the Garden of Eden, but we were surrogated in the Garden of Gethsemane. You're familiar with that term surrogate, aren't you? It means substitute. We refer to a woman who gives birth to a child that another person will raise as the surrogate mother. Jesus became our substitute. In the Garden of Eden, Satan engaged in battle for the souls of mankind and won. But centuries later, Jesus waged war for those same souls in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he won. Satan, you see, won the battle, but Jesus won the war. And that's what happens in our lives. Satan may win many battles in our lives by luring us into temptation, but Jesus wins the war because he paid the penalty for that sin. So that when God announces sentence upon us for our sin, Jesus steps in front of us and takes it on himself. That was the purpose for him being born into the world. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he was crucified, he struggled with that purpose. He suffered for us there. Matthew's account tells us that after Jesus shared the Last Supper with his disciples in the upper room, he led them to the Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke's account, it says they went to the Mount of Olives, as we see in Luke 22:39. There is an explanation for that apparent incongruity. Gethsemane means olive press. John, in his gospel, called that place where they went after the Last Supper an olive grove in John 18:1. Matthew and Luke and John were all describing the same place. Gethsemane was an olive grove where olives were pressed for their oil. You see, farmers would take the olives that they had harvested and put them in this large stone bowl, and then they would pull a heavy round stone over the olives, breaking them like we see in this picture. And then those ground olives would be placed in baskets that would be stacked 4 and 5 high and placed on an olive press, as we see in these next 2 photos. The baskets would be pressed so that the olive oil ran out of the crushed olives, flowing into a basin. The olives were pressed a total of 3 times. On the first pressing, a single stone weight would be attached to the beam to press the olives lightly, crushing out the purest oil, what we would call virgin olive oil. That oil was reserved for special use in the temple. The second pressing would be made by adding more stones to the beam. Back up to the second picture. As you see there, more stones would be added for the second pressing, and the oil would be maybe just a little bit darker. It would be of a lesser quality, but usable for cooking. And then additional stones were put on that press for the third pressing, crushing the olives even more. This product that came out of them was the dregs of the oil and was used mostly in lighting homes in olive oil lamps. It was a darker oil, as we see in this final photograph. This all would have been done in that Garden of Gethsemane where an olive grove was growing. I think Jesus chose that place for his night of wrestling in prayer for this very reason. How many times were the olives pressed in ancient Israel? 3. How many times did Jesus struggle in prayer there? 3, according to Matthew 26:44. Jesus went and prayed a third time. 3 times he prayed. It was during this third prayer time that Matthew refers to that Luke's account tells us that Jesus was under so much pressure that blood seeped from the pores of his skin. This is actually a medical condition known as hematodrosis. It is caused by extreme stress. I saw this once several years ago in a friend who had just given birth. I arrived soon after the baby was born and went into her hospital room, and I was shocked to see that many small blood vessels in her face had burst and blood had seeped out of the pores in her skin. The birth process had put her under extreme stress. Jesus was under so much stress in the Garden of Gethsemane that his blood was pressed from him. In the first garden, Adam failed to stand against sin. In the second garden, Jesus was pressed down by the weight of our sin. That was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah 700 years before the time of Christ. When he wrote this in Isaiah 53:5, he was crushed for our iniquities. You will certainly die, God warned, if they ate the forbidden fruit. And so now the death of our bodies is inevitable, but we can escape the death of our souls. We can escape what the Bible calls the second death, as we see that worded this way in Revelation 20:14 when it says, the lake of fire is the second death. The Bible tells us that a record book is kept in heaven. The names of the followers of Jesus are recorded in it. It is called the Lamb's Book of Life. And so Revelation 20:15 tells us anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. They experienced the second death. We are all guilty. But Jesus was crushed for us so that despite our sin, we can be saved. May we see ourselves for what we really are. But more importantly, may we see Jesus for who he is. Our Savior, the forgiver of our sin, our Redeemer. And he offers salvation this morning if you've never accepted. He suffered for you. His blood was pressed out so that you can find forgiveness. And God offers that this morning. If you'd like to accept it, we invite you to come as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.